The morning began like every other morning. Or at least, that's what everyone believed. The sun rose quietly. Coffee cups were filled. Curtains were opened. Phones buzzed with ordinary notifications. Somewhere, people rushed to work without realizing that, for one family, this ordinary morning would quietly become the beginning of a completely different future. And somehow, without even knowing it, that future was connected to you. You have probably spent countless moments wondering whether someone out there truly thinks about you the way you think about them. Maybe you've questioned whether your feelings matter. Maybe you've wondered if the distance between two hearts can ever truly disappear. Those questions are natural. But today, imagine something different. Imagine that while you were busy living your own life, another conversation was unfolding behind closed doors. Not between strangers. Not between friends. But inside the home of the person whose heart has slowly been changing because of everything they've come to understand about you. And at the center of that conversation was one unexpected person. Your soulmate's mother. No one expected her to speak first. In fact, everyone assumed she would remain silent. She had watched quietly for months. She had noticed little things that nobody else paid attention to. The way her son smiled whenever your name accidentally appeared. The way his mood shifted after hearing even the smallest update about you. The way he became quieter whenever someone suggested giving up. A mother notices things that words never explain. She doesn't always ask questions. She observes. She remembers. She compares. And little by little, she begins to understand. This morning, she reached a conclusion she could no longer ignore. She looked across the breakfast table. There was silence. Not uncomfortable silence. The kind of silence that appears just before someone says something important. She placed her coffee down. Looked directly at her son. And asked one simple question. Are you still thinking about that person? He didn't answer immediately. Not because he didn't know. Because he knew exactly who she meant. Some names never need to be spoken. Some people leave a mark so quietly that everyone eventually notices. He smiled. A small smile. The kind people try to hide when they're protecting something precious. His mother noticed. Of course she noticed. She had been waiting for that smile. 4 weeks. Maybe even months. Then she said something that surprised everyone sitting in the room. If your heart keeps returning to the same person, maybe it's trying to tell you something your mind keeps arguing with. The room became completely still. Nobody interrupted. Nobody laughed. Nobody changed the subject. Sometimes the simplest sentences carry the greatest weight. He looked down at the table. Not because he disagreed. Because hearing those words from his own mother made everything feel real. For the first time, someone else had spoken aloud what he had been quietly carrying inside. Have you ever experienced that feeling? When someone understands something about your heart before you ever explain it? It changes everything. Because suddenly, you don't feel invisible anymore. His mother continued speaking. She didn't talk about perfection. She didn't talk about fairy tales. She talked about peace. She said that real connections aren't always loud. Sometimes they're calm. Sometimes they're confusing. Sometimes they disappear for a while before finding their way back into your life. She admitted that when she first heard about you, she wasn't sure. Not because of anything bad. Simply because every parent hopes their child will choose wisely. She wanted to observe. To wait. To understand. And that's exactly what she had done. She watched how her son changed. She noticed he became more patient. Kinder. More thoughtful. She noticed he started believing in his future again. Not because everything became easy, but because thinking about you reminded him that some people inspire growth without even trying. That realization stayed with her. Long after everyone else forgot about the conversations. Long after ordinary days returned. Until this morning. The morning she finally decided to speak. If you're listening right now, take a moment to think about someone who quietly encouraged you to become a better version of yourself. Not through pressure. Not through demands. Simply by existing. Those people are rare. And when they appear, they often leave a lasting impression on everyone around them, not just the person who loves them. Your soulmate's mother had begun seeing exactly that. She wasn't looking only at your actions. She was looking at the person her own child was becoming. Sometimes that's where the biggest answers are found. Not in promises, but in transformation. As breakfast ended, everyone stood up. Chairs moved. Plates were cleared. The conversation seemed finished. Or so it appeared. But just before walking away, she turned around one last time. She smiled gently. Then she quietly said, "If someone brings peace into your life, don't let fear convince you to walk away." Those words stayed with him. Even after the room became empty. Even after the dishes were washed. Even after the house returned to complete silence. Because deep inside, he knew exactly who she was talking about. And for the first time in a very long time, he stopped asking himself whether reaching out would be the right decision. Instead, he began wondering whether waiting any longer would be the biggest mistake of all. He walked toward his room carrying thoughts that suddenly felt lighter than they had in months. But he had no idea that what he was about to discover next would make his mother's words even more impossible to ignore. To be continued in Part 2. He closed the door behind him and stood still for a moment. The house had gone quiet, yet his thoughts had become louder than ever. His mother's words echoed in his mind. If someone brings peace into your life, don't let fear convince you to walk away. He had spent so much time convincing himself that waiting was the safest choice. Waiting until life became less complicated. Waiting until the timing felt perfect. Waiting until every uncertainty disappeared. But now, for the first time, he wondered if waiting had slowly become another name for avoiding the truth. He sat beside the window and looked outside. The world carried on as usual. Cars passed. Neighbors greeted one another. Children laughed somewhere in the distance. Everything seemed ordinary. Yet inside him, something had quietly shifted. He reached for his phone. Not because he had already decided what to do, but because your name had found its way back into his thoughts once again. He didn't open your conversation immediately. Instead, he simply looked at your contact. Sometimes the hardest step isn't speaking. It's allowing yourself to believe that speaking is still possible. Have you ever stared at someone's name on your screen for several minutes without typing a single word? You imagine every possible outcome. You wonder whether too much time has passed. You ask yourself if they've moved on. You question whether they'll even want to hear from you. Those thoughts are familiar to almost everyone. And that morning, they were familiar to him, too. He placed the phone back on the table. Not because he had changed his mind. Because he wanted to understand his own heart before making any decision. At that very moment, there was a gentle knock on his bedroom door. It was his mother. She stepped inside with the same calm expression she had worn throughout breakfast. She wasn't there to pressure him. She simply sat in the chair across from him. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. Sometimes silence creates the space where honesty finally feels safe. She looked at him and smiled. "I've been your mother your whole life," she said softly. "I know the difference between someone you're trying to forget, and someone you've never stopped caring about." He looked away. Not because he disagreed. Because hearing those words made it impossible to keep pretending. She continued. "When people truly matter to us, life has a strange way of reminding us. Not to make us live in the past, but to help us decide what kind of future we actually want." Those words settled into the room with surprising gentleness. There was no dramatic speech. No impossible promises. Just quiet honesty. And sometimes, that's exactly what changes someone's perspective. She stood up and walked toward the door. Then she paused. One final sentence escaped her lips. "You don't have to know how the story ends before taking the first step." With that, she left. The room felt different after she was gone. It wasn't because she had solved every problem. It was because she had replaced fear with possibility. He picked up his phone once more. This time, he opened your conversation. The old messages were still there. Simple conversations. Moments that once felt ordinary. Looking back now, they seemed much more meaningful. He smiled at a memory. A conversation that had ended with laughter. A kind message sent on an ordinary afternoon. A shared dream about places you both hoped to visit someday. Life has an interesting way of hiding precious moments inside ordinary days. We often recognize their value only after time has passed. As he scrolled, one thought became impossible to ignore. The connection had never disappeared completely. Life had simply become busy. Misunderstandings had created distance. Silence had lasted longer than either of you expected. But silence isn't always the end of a story. Sometimes, it's simply the chapter where both people are learning something they couldn't have understood any other way. If you've ever experienced distance in an important relationship, you probably know this feeling. Not every silence means someone has stopped caring. Sometimes people are simply trying to become the version of themselves that can communicate more honestly. He locked the phone again. Still no message. Not yet. Instead, he opened a notebook resting on his desk. Inside were goals, ideas, dreams, little reminders he had written to himself months ago. One sentence immediately caught his attention. Become someone who is brave enough to choose honesty over fear. He almost laughed. He couldn't even remember writing it. Yet today, it felt as though those words had been waiting for this exact moment. Downstairs, his mother quietly folded the morning laundry. She wasn't wondering whether he would send a message. She wasn't trying to control the outcome. She simply hoped her son would make a decision he could be proud of, regardless of what happened next. Parents often understand something important. Peace doesn't always come from getting the answer you hope for. Sometimes peace comes from finally having the courage to ask the question. Upstairs. He unlocked the phone again. His fingers rested on the keyboard. One sentence appeared. Then disappeared. He deleted it. Started again. Deleted it once more. He smiled to himself. It's harder than I thought, he whispered. Yet this time, he didn't put the phone away. Instead, he took a slow breath, looked at your name one more time, and realized something that changed everything. He wasn't writing because he expected perfection. He was writing because some people deserve honesty more than endless silence. And just as he prepared to type the very first heartfelt sentence, his phone suddenly vibrated. A new notification appeared on the screen. It wasn't from you. It was from someone who had unexpectedly become part of this story. Someone whose message would reveal a detail neither he nor his mother had seen coming. The words on the screen made him freeze. He read them once. Then again. And in that single moment, he realized this morning's decision was only the beginning of something far bigger than anyone in the family had imagined. To be continued in Part 3. The notification stayed on the screen. For a few seconds, he simply stared at it. His heart wasn't racing because of fear. It was racing because life has a strange habit of bringing unexpected moments together when we least expect them. He tapped the message. It was from someone he hadn't spoken to in quite some time. A trusted family friend. Someone who knew both families well enough to understand the story but respectful enough never to interfere. The message was simple. I hope you're doing well. I spoke with your mother earlier today. She shared something that made me think. Before another week passes, don't leave important conversations unfinished. Sometimes a single honest conversation brings more peace than months of wondering. He read it twice. Then a third time. What surprised him wasn't the advice. It was the fact that his mother hadn't been trying to convince him. She hadn't been making plans behind his back. She had simply shared what was on her heart with someone she trusted, hoping her son would eventually find clarity for himself. That realization mattered. Because it reminded him of something important. Real support doesn't force decisions. It creates space for better ones. He set the phone down and walked back toward the window. The sunlight had grown brighter. The neighborhood looked exactly the same. Yet he no longer felt like the same person who had woken up that morning. Sometimes change isn't loud. It doesn't arrive with dramatic music or extraordinary events. Sometimes it begins with a quiet realization that you're tired of letting uncertainty make your choices. Have you ever reached that point? The point where you realize you've spent more energy imagining conversations than actually having them? Many people have. And once that realization arrives, something inside begins to shift. Downstairs, his mother was arranging flowers in a small glass vase. She smiled to herself. Not because she knew what her son would do next, but because she had finally spoken honestly. Parents often carry words in their hearts for a long time. Not because they're hiding them. Because they wait for the right moment. This morning had been that moment. A little while later, he walked downstairs. His mother looked up. Neither of them mentioned the conversation from breakfast. Neither needed to. Instead, he helped place the flowers on the table. It was a small gesture. Yet somehow it carried quiet meaning. As they stood there together, he broke the silence. You really believe some people come into our lives for a reason, don't you? She smiled. I believe people teach us something. Some teach us patience. Some teach us courage. And a few. She paused for a moment. Teach us who we become when we're at our best. Those words settled deeply. Because they weren't really about romance. They were about growth. About becoming kinder. Braver. More honest. He nodded slowly. I think I've been afraid. His mother didn't ask what he meant. She already understood. Instead, she replied with gentle wisdom. Courage isn't the absence of uncertainty. It's choosing honesty even when the outcome isn't guaranteed. That sentence stayed with him. Not because it promised everything would work out perfectly. Because it reminded him that peace often comes from sincerity rather than certainty. Later that afternoon, he went for a walk. No destination. No detailed plan. Just time to think. The familiar streets seemed different. Not because they had changed. Because he was seeing them through new eyes. He remembered moments that once felt insignificant. The first conversation that made him smile unexpectedly. The time you encouraged him during a difficult week. The way even simple words had stayed with him longer than either of you probably realized. It's remarkable how memory works. The biggest moments aren't always the loudest ones. Sometimes they're hidden inside ordinary conversations we almost forgot. If you've ever looked back and realized a small act of kindness changed your perspective, then you understand exactly what he was feeling. As the afternoon slowly turned toward evening, he found himself standing near a quiet park. Families were walking together. Children were playing. An elderly couple sat on a bench, sharing stories and laughing softly. He watched them for a moment. Then something his mother had once said years ago came back to him. The strongest relationships aren't built on perfect days. They're built by two people who keep choosing kindness on ordinary ones. He smiled. Maybe he had been searching for certainty when what really mattered was